Hello, true creatives, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Michael Easter. Michael is a professor of journalism at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he's also the author of the recent book, The Comfort Crisis. So we're going to be talking about how it can be quite valuable to get uncomfortable. Michael, it's wonderful having you here today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So, Michael, for people who don't know about you and your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So I worked in magazines for a lot of years. I worked at Men's Health magazine in the US for 7-8 years, something like that. And then I left there about 5-ish years ago to be a professor at UNLV, and I teach in the journalism department. So in that role, half of my job is teaching, working with students and all that. And the other half is continuing to write, doing books, doing magazine articles. And my writing, it all tends to focus on human health, human performance, human well-being, all those kind of things. And I tend to tell those stories through kind of an adventure lens with a lot of different narratives around them. And so, yeah, I'm kind of more a health writer who writes about what the average person can do to improve their health rather than, what happens in a doctor's office. So
now, I think when most people think about health, they think about being in great condition and being quite comfortable in their own skin. But you're emphasizing the importance of not necessarily always being comfortable. So can you tell us a little bit about your book, The Comfort Crisis?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, the book is about the benefits of embracing discomfort. And I look at a handful of different discomforts that humans evolved to face that used to keep us relatively healthy, right? And now we've sort of engineered those discomforts out of our lives. I think we can all sort of relate to the fact that the world seems to be getting more and more comfortable in a lot of different ways over time, right? So when you look at how humans evolved, we evolved to always do the next most comfortable thing, the next easiest thing. And the reason was because, back in our environments that were uncomfortable, there was never enough food, like we were exposed to weather, we would have to put in effort for everything we did. It made sense to always do the next most comfortable, easiest thing. That instinct kept us alive, right? But we've only recently sort of tipped our environments to those of comfort, and this drive we have is now backfiring. So you think about, like, the average person can, survive, live relatively well, taking like 1,000 steps a day. We have easy access to super calorie dense food, right? A lot of us work with our minds instead of our bodies. We live in temperature control. We have all this stimulation around us all the time. So we have easy ways to kill boredom, on and on and on. So the book really looks at how this tip into comfort has affected us as people in a lot of different ways, mind, body, sense of meaning. And I tell that story by talking about this more than a month that I spent up in the Arctic in Alaska. That's kind of the main through line of the book, and a bunch of other traveling I did all around the world, meeting with scientists who are kind of studying the different topics I'm talking about, with sort of leaders in the field, innovators, all that kind of thing.
So when you're talking about comfort, it's not just what I imagine sitting on a nice comfortable sofa, binging Netflix or whatever it might be. What other aspects of comfort did you investigate, and why those a negative thing? I mean, everyone wants to be comfortable, so what's so bad about that?
Yeah, again, well, it made sense forever, right? So for example, in one of the chapters, I talk about how we are wired to avoid any and all risk. Okay. So this made sense back when to live, you were forced to do risky things all the time, right? You'd have to go on a big hunt in order if you wanted to eat, right? If you wanted to move from summering to wintering grounds, that's a risky thing, you know? So we're wired to avoid risk, right? It's made sense. But nowadays we have the option of just like never doing anything risky at all. And this extends into like our creativity, our business careers. And it kind of like, we don't want to stick our necks out in public, all these different things. This ultimately holds us back, right? It's no longer a really rational fear. Even things like boredom. So the human brain evolved to basically this idea of boredom. It's a evolutionary discomfort that kicks on anytime whatever we're doing, the return on our time invested has worn thin. So let's say you and I are hunting, right? And the animals aren't coming through. We're just sitting on this hill. Well, boredom would kick on. And boredom would basically, it's this discomfort. And it's just like, oh, we got to, I don't like this. It tells us to go do something else. So then we'd go pick potatoes or whatever. So in our past, boredom used to tell us to go do something else. And that something else was usually something productive that would improve our lives. Well, now we have all these easy, effortless escapes from boredom in our lives, like all the time, right? What happens when people get bored now? You just pull out your cell phone, right? So it's no longer this positive thing in our lives. It's like anthropologists call overall this sort of topic I'm talking about an evolutionary mismatch. It's when these traits and behaviors that we evolved to have in one environment, when you move them into another environment, they backfire more or less. Even think of our food system, right? It's like hunger is this thing that basically tells your body like you need to eat, right? Well, now we are surrounded in this sea of food, and we often use food for reasons other than real hunger, right? Food is used as a widget when we feel stressed. We sometimes eat just because it's like, oh, it's noon and that's lunchtime and that's when I eat, right? So like you look at the research and people only eat, I think 20% of the time when they're physiologically hungry. 80% of the time we eat is for reasons other than real hunger. And of course, like physicality is a really easy one to grasp. I mean, it used to be very normal for the average person to walk more than 10 miles a day, right? And we weren't just walking, we're also carrying stuff. We're also digging. We're also doing all these other things. And now the average person takes like 3,000 to 4,000 steps a day. I mean, we don't have to move anymore. And this is like, all of this stuff is associated with our declining physical health. So things like cardiovascular disease, I mean, that wasn't even a thing until like 1900, not even mentioned in medical textbooks until about 1904. But also mental health problems, all the screen time we have and the lack of real challenges associated with a lot of the mental health problems we're facing now, like depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And from someone who looks at most things through a lens of the science behind innovation and creativity, a couple of things that you talked about there really struck a chord with me. So I'd like to touch on three things. One is what you talked about when it comes to risk aversion. One is what you talked about when it comes to boredom. And the other one is sort of building on those into this idea of the status quo and routine that we have day in and day out. And I think I'd like to start with boredom, just because one of my favorite studies popped into my mind, which looked at what happened when people were put into a room and the only object in the room was a buzzer. And if you pressed that buzzer, you would get an electric shock, a very uncomfortable, not lethal, but a very uncomfortable electric shock. And that's the only distraction that was available. And apparently less than half of the women chose to shock themselves, but more than 2/3 of the men, when there was nothing else to do, would repeatedly shock themselves because it's the only thing they had available other than being bored. So they chose discomfort over being in their own mind and being bored. There seems to be a real desire in society nowadays to avoid being in your own head at any costs.
Yeah, I think so. Another one I love, like there's a lot of interesting research around boredom and creativity too. And they've had one group do whatever they want. You put them in a room and you can go on your cell phone, read a magazine, whatever the hell. And the other group, they bore the hell out of these people. And then they give them both creativity tests. And the bored group always comes up with more creative answers than the non-bored group. And that's simply because they think today we rarely let our minds rest and wander, to your point that you just made, right? Like anytime we have this moment of downtime, it's like, I can't handle this. I got to like go on my cell phone, or we focus our attention outward. We don't like focusing inward. And the problem with that is that whenever you're focusing outwardly, your brain is actually working pretty hard. It's like an active work state. It's kind of like working out, right? But when you have time to mind wander, it's more of like a down rest state. And that allows your kind of mind to revive and go inward, come up with these like creative different ideas and go off to different places. So, I make the argument in the book that we need more time where we experience boredom, because
Absolutely.
there's less and less of it now. It's like you look at the average, I know, and the average American, at least now, is spending more than 12 hours a day engaged with digital media. So for millions of years, we had nothing digital in our lives. And now this stuff has become our lives. That's obviously done a lot in changing our lives and how our brain works, right?
It's not just it's not just millions of years. I can remember, just to show my age a little bit, I grew up probably as the last generation without a cell phone. So I got my first cell phone when I was 18. And I'm sure for the hundreds of years before us, parents complained about books that they were distracting their kids. Then it was radio, and then it was TV. And I had TV when I was younger, but when we left the house, effectively, you didn't have any instant means to distract yourself. I remember times when I was in high school and you met up with your friends by agreeing 2 or 3 days beforehand exactly where and at what time you were going to meet up. And then if you had to wait for someone for half an hour, you literally just had to wait. But nowadays, with people, not just children growing up with cell phones, but everyone who's had a cell phone for any amount of time, it's amazing how quickly this addictive dopamine rush seems to have triggered something in our primordial brain, that it's a lot more pleasant to scroll and play games or read news or doom scroll on Twitter or Instagram, whatever it might be, than to have the alternative, which is to not be distracted for a while.
Yeah. I mean, it's like we're always kind of going away from discomfort and going to comfort, and phones are comforting. Right? There's always like something there that can occupy your mind. And, in the book, you see a lot of stuff out there about how we need to use our phones less. And I agree. It's like, yeah, everyone knows it. Everyone gets it. But I think one thing that doesn't get talked about, which is what I talk about in the book, is that let's say you take an hour of time off your iPhone screen time. Well, then all of a sudden people go, oh, well, what the hell do I do with this new hour I found? And they go watch Netflix. They're like, oh, I'm bored, I'll watch Netflix. Or I'll like scroll on my computer screen. It's like your brain doesn't know the difference between those two things. It's literally the same thing, So I make the argument that we need to think about, instead of less phone, we need to think about more boredom and just less media overall. So in the book, I talk about, different doses of time outside. I think is an important way to sort of enhance this idea overall, where you're just totally disconnected. You don't bring your phone. You just kind of walk, whatever, hang out, let your mind just totally go to the weird places it needs to go to. And I'm not saying that you're automatically going to be struck with, a brilliant idea immediately. There's going to be some weird stuff that bubbles up and is just completely useless. But every now and then you're going to have a good idea. You're going to like think about something in a different way than you haven't. And then you can take that back into your work life. And I think it can be beneficial.
So boredom is actually, there's a lot of research behind it. Mind wandering and boredom is good for your creativity. One thing which is not very good for your creativity, which you've talked about as well, is this risk aversion. So there's very much a biological need to be risk averse, but it seems like in today's society, from kindergarten through school, through, in some cases, college or into the workplace, and with a lot of society pressure and parental pressure as well, we seem to be brought up as a community, as a society, to respect risk aversion and to do the safe things. So yeah. Is this as negative as you're making it out to be, or how can you find that balance between being aware of risk but not letting it overpower your life?
Yeah, well, I think that I'll answer that two ways. I mean, we know that people need a certain amount of challenge in their life, or else they don't do well. So what tends to happen is like you look at the research on people who have faced like massive challenges in their life, and people who have had tons and tons of challenges, just one after the other, they have bad their mental health outcomes are not great. But at the same time, you look at people who have no challenge in their life and they have equally poor rates of mental health. There's a sweet spot where by going through a certain amount of challenge, you learn something about yourself and you can adapt to future things that come your way. Right. So I think what has happened over time is that as we've removed more and more challenge from our life, we're increasingly getting into the like no challenge. And now we're having poor mental health outcomes. Right. So you look at, for example, kids in the 90s, helicopter parenting starts in about the 1991, 1992. And this is just due to some like media concerns over kidnapping that weren't realistic, but parents stopped letting their kids go outside and just play. You know, it's like when I was a kid, my mom would just be like, yeah, just be home by sundown or whatever. So these kids born after 1991, they were more likely to not be able to just go outside. And what happens when you're outside, right? It's like you go in the woods, you fall, you get hurt, you meet up with some other kids, and maybe you get in a fight with them. And, you know, all these things happen, but you learn something about yourself and what you're capable of and how to handle yourself in future situations. Well, when you take that away, it's like you just have kids behind screens and they're like never really tested, right? And so then you throw those kids out into the real world, and all of a sudden, when they are faced with the challenge, whether it be something like someone disagreeing with them, you know, publicly in a classroom or something like that, like it becomes this big thing because they've never had anything else, right? So like your brain just, it puts things all in relative terms, you know? And when you think about the type of challenges that we used to face as we evolved, failure would mean death, right? If I'm on a hunt and we don't get food, I'm going to starve to death. And also, like, hunting is dangerous, right? Let's say you have to move from your wintering to your summering grounds. You got to go across this pass. It's dangerous, right? There's tigers lurking in the bushes. So we don't ever want to fail because failure used to mean death. But nowadays, failure is like, oh, I misspoke on this podcast, or I misspelled a word in this slideshow I was giving to my boss and he gave me this shitty look, right? So we still see that as like this ultimate failure that like we view it just as we would have in the past, like it was going to kill us, right? But that ultimately just holds us back because nothing in life now, especially, ever comes without a risk of failure. And the reality is you're not going to die anymore, right? So we're just afraid of way more than we should be.
I think when you've been, while you were talking, I was trying to imagine what you were going through when you were in the Arctic. Was it the Arctic or the Antarctic that you were doing this expedition?
It was the Arctic. It was the Alaskan Arctic. Yep.
I mean, that when it comes to places on Earth that probably still present actual physical risk of death or at least grievous bodily harm, that's probably one of the main ones. So can you just tell us a little story about what it was like there by yourself for your own feelings, but also I assume you weren't there without any guides or without people who had gone through experiences before. And how did you see the risk compared to how someone experienced who'd done it and knew the secrets of survival? How did they treat it?
Yeah, so I went up there with a friend, two friends. One of them's name is Donnie Vincent. He's this backcountry bow hunter and filmmaker, and he goes into really remote places for long stretches of time and makes these movies that are kind of like Planet Earth, but they're with hunting. But he's a really fascinating guy, and his cinematographer was along with us. And so it was fascinating because, I mean, like one of the main things, for example, that I was worried about, and I think most people would be when I talk to people, is grizzly bears. Like there's gigantic grizzly bears up there. And we saw a lot of them. And Donnie was just like, dude, like, don't worry about grizzly bears. And I was just like, well, why? And he's like, well, there's 3 of us and there's 1 of them. Like they want nothing to do with us. We're a way bigger risk to them than they are to us. Like, just stop worrying about it. You know, I was like, oh, okay, I guess you're right. So that was kind of like this shift in my mindset, right? Where I realized, oh, okay, I don't have to worry about this. On the other hand, what people don't worry about up there is you usually have to take a flight on like a 2-seater plane to get out, to where we wanted to be. We had to take flights on like this little 2-person plane. Now that is the thing that'll kill you. Those things go down all the time, and yet people don't really think twice about that. Or the weather, right? People are like, they don't worry about the weather as much, but like that statistically is the stuff that is going to kill you. So I think sometimes we have like an unfounded, we're bad at calculating what is actually risky and what is not, more or less.
So let's take it back to this third point that you mentioned, which I think has a very, very clear relationship with not just creativity, but actually innovation, probably more powerfully. And that is the status quo and the status quo bias. Since we've now not only grown up to want to be as comfortable as possible, but when we get into a routine, and especially a routine at work, there's a lot of psychological evidence that people would rather stay in the way that they are now compared to the risk of changing anything, because any change could be negative, and there's the brain hates uncertainty. So when you're thinking about what it takes to convince people to be willing to be uncomfortable some of the time, and you have a group that they're comfortable doing what they want to do, but if they don't change something, someone else is going to out innovate them. They're going to potentially be disrupted. How do you talk with other people about making them maybe appreciate wanting to be a bit less comfortable, any small steps they can take, especially with teams who might want to or need to try new things and be more innovative?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is like, and this extends to like all things in life. It's like, what's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? You're not going to die, right? It's like, I think in our past, it's like, oh, yeah, you could have died, right? Nowadays, it's like, I remember I was talking to one of my friends who had, he's got this big successful company in the fitness space. And we were just talking about this, and, you know, it's like, let's say you lost everything, dude. Like your company goes under, your wife decides that she doesn't like you now that you don't have this company, and she takes your kids, and the bank repos all your shit. Like, what are you going to do? Like, what's the worst that could happen? Like, that would suck. I'm not saying that wouldn't be awful, but like, you would figure it out. We've got enough social safety nets now that it's like, all right, well, I guess you just draw some money from the government for a couple months. Like, you're a smart guy, come up with another idea. Like, you're going to be fine. Right. And by not being willing to risk just a little bit, you know, because in the grand scheme of time and space, the risks that we take are rather small, right? Like most companies aren't going to like make a risk that could literally just collapse everything at a given moment, right? But by not taking those small incremental risks, we'll really end up holding ourselves back, you know. And even if people have to be let go from a job, it seems terrible, and it's not optimal, but at the same time, it's like people are going to be fine today, you know? And so I think that ultimately we just we just have way too much fear about the downsides of this risk that we're taking, rather than realizing like, well, the downsides actually aren't that bad in the grand scheme of time and space, but the upsides is like, that's how we're going to grow and get to the next place.
We've talked a lot about fear around sort of wanting to avoid risk. If fear is an extreme emotion, is there anything else that's driving people to want to just stick to this comfortable routine that's maybe not as extreme?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that, you know, we generally prefer routines because, you know, in our past, those used to keep us safe. And, you know, if your brain could sort of, if you could live a predictable lifestyle, like you knew where your food was, you knew where your shelter was, you knew where those grizzly bears hung out, like that kept you safe, right? But today, we still fall into those predictable routines, but we don't necessarily need them for our safety anymore, right? So I think what tends to happen is there's some scientists at Cambridge, they talked about how your brain sort of can go on this autopilot mode where you're not really aware and engaged and present in life. You're just sort of like going through these motions. And what tends to happen is that you perceive your life as going by faster. And so one of the antidotes to this is to try and learn and do new things, because when you're learning and doing a new thing, your brain can't really predict what's going to happen next, right? So you all of a sudden you get forced into focus and awareness. And these can be small, like new skills, but it could also be something big. It could be like, I'm going to try this sport that I've always wanted to try. And you're going to absolutely suck at it at first. You're going to have to like focus intensely on doing this, but like that, this doing new things, that sort of slows down your perception of time going by. And that's why, for example, time seemed to go by a lot slower when you were a kid, because the world was just, everything coming at you was new.
I think there's again a lot of research behind why the brain prefers to go into this autopilot mode. And I experienced it very often when I was commuting in my management consulting job back in London. I would always go to the same platform for the same underground train line, and I knew exactly where I needed to stand to be at the door, which is most likely to get you the seat. So I would effectively just autopilot, walk that way. And one weekend, I was going to meet up with my friends in a completely different part of London. And I noticed after a while that I was on the wrong train, because my brain, when it started walking towards the station, just completely shut off all of the new inputs and did what it was doing on autopilot. And there's reasons why the brain prefers this. The more you use these brain networks, the more the synapses between them become stronger through long-term potentiation, and the neurons themselves become more efficient by having a thicker myelin sheath. So using memories that you know of work can be in the order of 70 to 100 times less energetically demanding and hundreds of times faster for the brain to process. So we've evolved to go into this autopilot mode, but that exact evolution, which makes our brains so efficient, also makes us less willing to try new things, because they are actually harder for the brain to do.
Yeah, they're harder. And you have to actually now think about them. It's like, for example, like when I was learning to swim, the moment that I realized that I was getting good at swimming is that when I was swimming, I wasn't thinking about swimming. Right? Like as I'm learning, I'm just like the whole time in my brain, I'm like, I got to do this thing, this thing, this thing. Oh, this thing sucks. This thing, you got to do all this. And then like after enough mornings in the pool, all of a sudden I'm thinking about like, that episode of that TV show I watched last night. And it was like, oh, wait, yeah, I must be getting good, because now I'm just doing this kind of automatically, which is good. That's what we need to improve. But also like, I definitely remember those times when I'm first learning way more than the times when I go into the pool now, right? Because everything's new and it's like, I have to be right there.
Absolutely. Michael, it's been wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out how they themselves can become a bit less comfortable and they want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Well, my book is called The Comfort Crisis. You can check that out. It's available wherever books are sold. I'm at eastermichael.com on the web. And then on Instagram, I am Michael_Easter.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. Michael, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they're backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.